meet my bride. Let's go for a ride in my newfangled automobile. Just where we will go, nobody knows, but it's sure a great way to feel. Behind the wheel of the speed meter steel, it's my newfangled automobile.
Oh yeah, power. If you want to move things, you're going to need power. The bigger and faster you want to move, the more power you need. And in today's world, a battle for power has begun in the automotive industry. The conventional gas engine cars are being attacked by hybrids, electrics, alternative fuels, and even more ways to power cars, making them more efficient, cleaner, easier and cheaper to operate. But this is not a new battle. Rather, it is a continuation of a long and cold war between old foes. What we in the modern world are seeing is simply round two in a war that began in the 1890s, and by the end of what is commonly known as World War I, had seen a victor. And that victor is now having that victory challenged. Of course, I am speaking of the Great Power War. What was the best way to power a car? All sorts of methods had been tried in the 19th century, but for the moment, let's make a benchmark here of the year 1900. In the mainstream automotive industry, there were three main categories of power plants used to drive cars: external combustion engines, internal combustion engines, and electric motors. Let's take a brief look at each of them in turn. An external combustion engine is one where the energy created by the fuel source is produced outside of the engine itself. Steam engines are the common example of this, as the actual burning of the fuel to make the steam is not done in the engine, but rather outside in the boiler. The steam is then sent to the pistons to transfer the potential energy into motive energy. Steam engines are not the only external combustion engines. Compressed air and other energy sources can and have been used, but in 1900, such were not in the offing for automotive use. For the internal combustion engine, the fuel is burned inside the engine. Usually in the cylinder where the piston is, the fuel is somehow forced into the engine and ignited, which produces the motive power. At the turn of the last century, many methods had been tried to power a car with an internal combustion engine. There were two types that had become dominant: the two-stroke and the four-stroke engine. An electric motor was also used for cars in this era. There are two basic types available: alternating current or AC motors and direct current or DC motors. The DC type were, and still are for that matter, the way to go, and for this reason: batteries do not produce the same kind of current as is found in a wall socket. Unlike the wall socket or wall outlet, where the current voltage changes polarity some 60 times a second or so, batteries simply produce power at the voltage that they can maintain. So a DC motor is naturally designed to run off of batteries. And if you put plenty of batteries in a car, you're off and rolling. If you use an AC motor, you either have to use circuitry to convert the battery power to alternative current, or mount some other engine into the car to run a generator that would in turn run the motors. And that was done on some occasions, but such a system has quite a bit of inherent loss. And so the DC motor was the dominant system in the vintage era amongst electric cars. Now, let's look at each of the combatants a bit more closely. External combustion engines, the type that run off of steam, were the first on the scene, having been around since the early 18th century. By the mid-19th century, steam engines had been developed and refined quite a bit through their applications in the locomotive, manufacturing, and naval industries. But it wasn't until the 1880s that steam engines were built small enough to power personal cars. Albert de Dion and Léon Serpollet are a couple of examples of early pioneers during this era of steam-powered cars. Consider the steam cars of 1899. These used either simple or compound engines. A simple steam engine has a piston that is pushed by the steam produced from both directions in the cylinder and then ejected or vented from the engine. In a compound engine, the steam pushes one piston and then gets sent to another piston to get more push out of the same steam. In cars, 1, 2, or 4-cylinder steam engines were what was used. A 1-cylinder engine was a simple one. A 2-cylinder was probably a compound with 1 high-pressure and 1 low-pressure cylinder, and a 4 was definitely a compound, 2 high-pressure cylinders and 2 low-pressure ones. Now, with steam engines, you also have to look at the boilers, which is what generates the power that the engine converts. In the early 19th century, fluid boilers were pretty standard. It's basically a water tank with a big hot pipe going through it to get the water boiling and a fire underneath to get the pipe hot and the tank hot. Wood, coal, or anything that burns could be used as fuel. But as the century went on, fire tube boilers were invented and developed further. You could still make a fire out of whatever you wanted, but now the water getting boiled was going through pipes in a very hot chamber, boiling as they went. Do you have a water heater in your home? No, you don't. Hot water doesn't need heating. Thanks, George Carlin. But the water heater in your home is basically an adaptation or variation of that fire tube boiler from back in the day. Throughout the 19th century, this type of boiler was refined, redesigned, and made more efficient. By the time you get to 1889, steam cars with efficient fire tube boilers seemed the way to go. And then the Paris World Exhibition happened, and the steam engine had some unexpected competition. When Carl Benz and Gottlieb Daimler showed up with their internal combustion engine cars, the world took notice. Such engines were newer than the steam engines, having been developed in the mid-19th century, but they had promise and were growing in power and potential very quickly. At that point, there were 2 types of internal or gas engines suited for cars, the 2-stroke and the 4-stroke engine. Each time a piston in such an engine goes up or down, that is called a stroke. In a 2-stroke engine, the piston goes up, compresses the fuel, and fires. The piston is forced down, stroke 1. Then the gases from the firing are exhausted. Once the piston is at the bottom of the cylinder, new gas is pumped in and the piston goes back up, stroke number 2. The 4-stroke engine differs in that the first stroke, the firing of the fuel, forces the piston down, but then the piston on the second stroke goes back up and uses valves to evacuate the exhaust on the second stroke. For stroke 3, the piston goes down to draw in new fuel and then on stroke 4 compresses it for firing. Both of these engine types were used for cars in this era, and each was found to be as well suited for specific uses. The 2-stroke engine could be made small, as it did not have much valves and associated timing machinery involved. Thus, it could reach very fast revolutions per minute very quickly, or RPM. Such responsiveness was wanted in small vehicles, and these engines are still used in many motorcycles, small and microcars, and portable engines for lawnmowers and such, even to this day. A disadvantage was that due to how much had to happen in the cylinder, these engines are difficult to balance, even if they have more than 2 cylinders. The 4-stroke engine, though more complex, was also easier to control and balance, and thus could be built bigger and with more cylinders. The ease of control also made them more efficient, while being cleaner in operation. Once folks figured out how to make a four-stroke that would fit into a car, the steam engine had some very serious competition. And another competitor soon joined into the ring. In the 1890s, electric DC motor and battery technology also reached the point where they would be small enough and powerful enough to drive cars. Although the motors were somewhat expensive to make due to the amount of copper in them, they were also, pound for pound, stronger than the rest, as long as they had electricity to back it up. Lead-acid batteries at the time did take quite a while to charge, but advances in their technology did hold a charge well enough for the purpose. Now, to the year 1900 again. All three power champions are in the ring, or perhaps triangle in this case, fighting it out. Let's look at each contender offers at the time, for good or not so good. In one corner, you've got steam. A lot to offer in this corner. Light a fire, heat up your water, and go. These engines have been around for over 100 years by this time, and people understood them. The engines are quiet running. You can burn as fuel pretty much anything you could toss into a fireplace or barbecue. The engine produced a huge amount of torque and can get you rolling quickly and fast. On the other hand, they took up to a half an hour to get started, so you would need to plan ahead before you went and drive. They were also rather dirty in operation. Rolling coal was simply what they did. They also needed quite a bit of maintenance to keep running well, and the boiler would also need constant maintenance and cleaning to work properly. In another corner was the gas engine, throwing out some punches. You didn't have to wait for the water to boil. With this guy, you just prime it, crank it, and go. Hopefully. These engines were physically larger than steam engines, but they also did not need a boiler. In fact, the only fuel they needed and used was gasoline or petrol. So in the long run, they were in fact lighter than a steam car's engine. You didn't have to carry a boiler, many gallons of water, and whatever you were going to burn in the boiler along with you. Just a tank of gas and an engine. But gas engines were not at that time nearly as powerful as a steam engine. So they had to get big and somewhat unwieldy to compete. They were also quite temperamental. Starting one wasn't just as easy as turn the crank. There was quite a process of lubricating, priming, setting timing, and other things that had to be done before you crank the thing. And if it backfires and you have your hand gripping the crank the wrong way, it will rip your thumb off. Not a good thing. Also, due to the need for a gas engine to be running at a bit of a clip, RPM-wise, before producing usable power, you need to add a clutch and a transmission of some sort for a gas car to get power to the ground usably. Steam cars do not need this, and so this does diminish the weight and space advantage of not having a boiler. Now in the third corner is the electric motor, and it's charged up for a fight. Compact, quiet, and very powerful pound for pound. By 1900, the DC motor had proven to be the fastest of them all, and the easiest to use. No lighting fires, no cranking and adjusting. You just get in and go. And as long as you had enough batteries, you can go anywhere in town. That was the issue, batteries. You could go in town, but out of town was a problem. The power grid that exists today didn't exist at that time. There were many towns and counties all over the world where electricity simply hadn't got there yet. And batteries of the day and the charging systems were very slow. It could take 4 to 7 days to fully charge a bank of car batteries, so long trips needed to be planned very carefully. So these three are fighting it out. One can run on trees and water, with some oil too. One needs a liquid fuel and the other a place to plug in and recharge. Obviously, steam has an advantage here, as wood and water are not hard to find even outside of civilization. But the gas cars and electric cars knew that they needed an infrastructure of some sort to supply their drivers with the fuel they needed, and thus the filling station was born. There were two types, both emerging at about the same time in major cities across the world: New York, Paris, London, Berlin. Filling stations for gas cars and those for electric. For the gas cars, the stations would have the fuel delivered by truck or wagon, and the drivers can then fill their tanks there. Since the gas can be transported to wherever a road is, such filling stations could be just about anywhere you wanted to put them. Electric filling stations of pre-World War I were found almost exclusively in large city centers. They looked somewhat like a dairy farm in that they were stalls for each car and charging machines you plug them into. If you lived in the then emerging suburbs, you could drive to town, plug in your car, do your business, and drive home. Early in the 1900s, steam cars made a change. Creating a national electric charging network was, in and of itself, going to be a massive undertaking. However, creating a national gas station network proved to be rather easy to do. Gas stations were popping up all over the place, and one of the big issues with steam engines was how long they took to get going and the soot and mess they created. If they could use gas as well, they would be cleaner, and since gas gets hot like right now when you light it, they would take less time to get started. And so the gas fire tube boiler was developed. It was smaller, worked better, easier to get going, and the time it took to get a head of steam on the road was cut in half. And it was clean, no more soot and grime. Plus, it could be filled up at the same place gas cars were. Yes, gas station owners of the day were very happy about this. Electric cars fought back with the development and distribution of the dry cell battery, still lead acid, but able to hold much more charge and thus extend the range of the electric car. Still took a couple of days to recharge from dead, but a major improvement. At about this time, various governments started issuing basic standards for cars. One of them was found in many countries, was the requirement that cars not produce any smoke or steam while they're in various city limits. Electric cars had no problem here, so not so much with the gas and the steam. For the steam cars, the condenser had to be developed to a greater degree. The condenser looks and acts kind of like a radiator. It cools the steam back into water to be recycled as opposed to just being vented into the air. For the gas cars, the invention of the muffler did the trick, as it not only made them quieter, but it also, through maintaining back pressure on the exhaust, greatly reduced the smoke emissions. It was early in the 1910s that the makers of the gas engine cars began to put the electric starter motor onto their engines. Now you really could get into your gas-powered car, fiddle a few knobs, turn a key, and go anywhere. There were gas stations. There were roads, sometimes. You didn't have to wait for it to build steam. You just go. Steam engines could use the same stations, but they didn't have that kind of convenience of use. Electric cars did have the convenience, but not the range or the recharging infrastructure to just go anywhere. Then, in 1914, or 17 for the Americans, the First World War, the first mechanized war, occurred. And when an army needs a car, they need it now and need it fueled to go anywhere. Only the gas engine could do that. And thus, throughout the war, nations used gas engine cars almost exclusively. Some nations doing so in massive proportions. Yes, that's you, France. Yeah, the cars of World War I would take a dozen specials to go over, but they were a decisive factor, both in the war and in the power war. Gas engines were developed extensively as nations threw money at engine technology for cars, tanks, small boats, and aircraft. And when the war was over and the dust settled, the gas engine stood supreme. Having won the battle, the gas engine did reign as the dominant power for cars for another 80 years. But that battle is sounding again. New contenders, as well as old ones, reinvented, have gotten back into the ring. Who will win this round, I can't say. But I can say that had that great power war of the 19th century gone differently, you could be right now driving a steam-powered car. Thanks for watching Vintage Car History. We'll see you next time. Peace.